Hey everybody, welcome back to Political Science 101 at Simmons College, American Government and Politics. Um, let's see, we're going to spend this week talking about the foundation of this country and how it impacts us today. Uh, this is not the first time this semester, and it certainly won't be the last time, that I have to cover some fairly awkward subject matter. Um, Especially regarding slavery and regarding the treatment of a government run mostly by white men early on, and mostly still to this day, mostly run by white men, and its treatment of what we would now call the ADOS population. That's American descendants of slaves. But I'm going to start out by talking about a time when it wasn't a matter of being a descendant of slaves, but a matter of actual slaves and how they were regarded at the time of this country's founding. So we're going to go back to, the country was founded in the late 1700s officially. You need to go back to the 1600s to really get into the origins of the original sin of the United States, and that is not only having slavery in the first place, but allowing slavery to perpetuate in through the founding of the nation up until the 1860s. So, I told you all, this is not a history class per se, and I'm not going to make you memorize names and dates. I'll keep this timeline very general. From the early days of the British colonies in what's now the United States. And just to recap some stuff you probably got in your grade school social studies class, when I say British colonies, I mean the eastern part of what's now the United States, which was owned and operated by the British government in London. And that's still, to this day, we're a long way from London. It's all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. But back then, it was a really long way. It was the same distance, but the only way to get here from there was by boat. It took forever, and not just anybody could get on a boat and go from London to the American colonies. It was a long voyage. And only certain people were able to make it this far over here, and once they did, it wasn't easy. The land was difficult to farm. There were trees everywhere. There were forests everywhere that had to be cleared. And they didn't have chainsaws, so they were using old-timey implements to clear the land, cut down the trees, and plow the fields. Well, first of all, cut down trees to make fields, and then plow the fields, or then build your houses and your barns and structures on that land. It was a process. It was an ordeal. And the weather was worse than they expected. And it should come as no surprise to you that the people who already lived here, the American Indians, they weren't always cool with the unwelcome invasion of their land, and so that was another obstacle that these British colonists had to overcome. So, but they beat all those things, the natural elements and the American Indians. They beat them back, and they by the late 1700s have 13 colonies. But I skipped over something very important. I mentioned that it was difficult to clear the land, difficult to farm the land. Much more difficult than a lot of colonists originally envisioned. They left England to come over to the United States, to the American colonies. And what did they do? Well, they brought indentured servants. These were white people mostly from England, Ireland, Scotland, from the British Islands, who were not. Some people would say they're like slaves. They were not like slaves. They were something in between slave and free. They were an indentured servant is someone who has an agreed time period that they're going to work without wages, and when that time is over, they're free. Why would they do that? Well, because they would get passage across the Atlantic to do it, and sometimes they would even get some land when their time was up. See how it's different from being a slave? It's not nearly the same because a slave doesn't have that time on the clock, that time on the shelf that runs up and then they're free. That's not how it works for a slave. They brought some of those indentured servants to do the hard labor that the rich colonists didn't want to do or weren't capable of doing physically or mentally. It's hard work, after all. They could have enslaved the American Indians because let's just get over the moral question of that for just a second. Not get over it, but set it aside for just a minute. And know that this was a time when there were still a lot of slaves all around the world. I'm not saying that's okay. I'm saying the exact opposite of that. It's the most evil thing. Well, one of the most evil things that humans can do to other humans is to put them in bondage. So, right up there with genocide. But they could have enslaved the American Indians, but there was a major problem there. If you enslave an American, if you're in, let's say you're in Jamestown, Virginia, one of the early colonies, and you go into a village and you capture some American Indians and you take them back to Jamestown, English colony, and tell them you're going to be a slave now, they might run away. And if they run away, they go back to their village. And so these Englishmen, they go to the Indian village and they say, have you seen our runaway slave? And they go, you mean my cousin you kidnapped last week? No, we haven't seen her at all. See the problem there? There was a problem with that approach. And so eventually, some Portuguese and some British sailors figured out that they could capture African people off that faraway continent, all the way across the Atlantic Ocean, bring them over to the Americas, and sell them as property to other Europeans who are already living here, people of European descent who are already living here. To be clear, slavery was still a widespread practice, and slavery has been widespread throughout all of human history, particularly up until the 19th century, 1800s. But really, it's always been a problem worldwide, and there have always been people who think it's no big deal, and there have always been people who think it's a huge deal that you cannot, you shall not. You should not. There's a moral imperative against treating humans as property. And that's something we're going to talk about the next 3 or 4 class lectures. With that being said, Portuguese and British sailors start trading in human beings, bringing them across the Atlantic Ocean from Africa, selling them as property first in the islands of the Caribbean, they called the West Indies, and then onto the American mainland. Thus began the most divisive and most significant debate in the history of American politics. That is, are black people on an equal legal footing with white people? Obviously, for the first 200 years or so of the slave trade, the answer was no, clearly. Legally. Now, morally, ethically, that's not what I'm talking about. But legally, the answer was no. And if you ever have a question about the law and how the law feels, look at how the law behaves. Look at how law enforcement behaves. Look at how the government behaves. And at that time, in all of the British colonies prior to the American Revolution, it was commonplace for white people to be buying and selling black people. Now, most of the northern colonies, and I'm defining north as north of Maryland and Kentucky. So if you want to look at a map right now, I'll give you a second to look at a map, even a modern day map of the United States, and you'll see Maryland, and you'll see Delaware. So I should say north of Maryland, Delaware, and Kentucky, and north of Missouri. When I say northern colonies, and the northern territories of the United States, prior to the American Revolution, which was the late 1700s, most of those colonies, decided that they weren't cool with slavery anymore. Their colonial governments decided that wasn't cool, and by the time of the official founding of this nation, by the time they got around to ratifying, in other words, passing the United States Constitution, those areas north of Maryland and Kentucky no longer officially allowed slavery. There were some major exceptions that I'm going to talk about on the next lecture, which will be late Wednesday night or early Thursday morning, your time, there in Louisville. I'll post the lecture where I'll get a little bit more detail into this, but there's the main takeaway for today is that the United States came into being from the British colonies in North America. And when we did so, when we became a nation, the founders of this nation allowed it to come into being, allowed the nation to come into being with slavery as a part of it. That's a problem. As I keep saying, it's a moral and ethical problem they'll talk more about in later lectures, but it was also a political problem because that you had barely over half of the early country, the early United States, of states and people who were not okay with slavery, who saw the reprehensible nature of humans owning humans. And whether they saw the political problems that were to come from that, or they were just morally outraged. Either way, half the country saw that slavery was a problem. And there may be some of you, I hope there are some of you actually, who stress out and lose sleep over political issues in the country today. But that was even more so the case in the late 1700s and early 1800s, the early days of the United States. This is the time of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. There were people, particularly in the northern states, but really everywhere, but certainly in the northern states, there were people who could not, have peace of mind as long as there were plantations down south where white people bought and sold black people as property. So that fundamental question, in the early days of the United States, are African people and people of African descent to be treated equally under the law as white people? In those days, the answer was clearly no. Whether or not American descendants of slaves are treated equally under the law today as white people is something that we're going to talk about in the lectures to come later in this semester. But just ponder on that issue, that terrifying issue that grew from the outrageous and damnable practice of American slavery. Arguably the most brutal form of slavery in the history of the world. Other countries have had slaves, had slavery as a practice, but American slavery was arguably the most brutal, the most inhumane. So, I hate to leave you on a down note like that, but this is some of the difficult material we have to talk about in this class, because if you want to understand American government and politics today and how it affects all of us, you've got to understand our past. And our past is complicated, to put it politely. Our past is horrifying, to put it bluntly. I will generally talk about it for the rest of the semester as somewhere in between those two, but not a lot of positivity there. Not in the past. But there are seeds of positivity in the past that I will talk about that we can build upon in this country. but only if we understand how our government works. And that's what this class is all about. So, thank you for watching this video. I'm going to talk to y'all. I'll post sometime late Wednesday night. I'll post a video, talk a little bit more about the founding of the country, about the Constitution, about the Three-Fifths Compromise, the Great Compromise, and even more than I already have in this class. I'm going to talk about the Electoral College and how we elect the president, and all the many problems with those moments of history and how they still impact us and reverberate today. Please do not forget to comment on this video. Let me know that you watched. Let me know that you watched, and if you have questions or thoughts, or just want to elaborate a little bit, post that as well. Otherwise, I'm going to talk to y'all later this week. Hope you're having a good start to your week. Hope you're all safe. Hope you're staying warm in this winter weather. And I'll talk to y'all soon.